We arrive at the conclusion of Paul's letters, the smallest in size, very small, his letter to Philemon. I'm not going to do introduction or things like that. Typically, we do that, right? But I just want to give just a general encouragement of what's going on here, right? So Paul is writing to Philemon, a Christian, and the issue is that is his bondservant, Onesimus, who actually was helping Paul out. And the context here outside of that is interesting, right? Because we have the Greco-Roman context of slavery, and or bond servanthood, doulos. And if you didn't know this, the vast majority of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. And Paul here is very interesting because Paul talks about slaves, and in the Greek New Testament, right, it's this word doulos, and it could be used to, it's like bond servant, slave. You kind of see it in different, translated in different ways, but it typically just it means a slave, like somebody who's under the authority of another. And Paul, in his letters, deals with people who are slaves. He also deals with people who are owners of slaves, and we don't want to think of slavery here in the same, uh, 18th, 17th century American context. That's not how slavery worked then. I'm not saying it's moral or anything like that. It's different. Similar but different. But what Paul does here in his letter to Philemon is marvelous. It's remarkable because he tells Philemon, as somebody who's over a slave, to treat the slave as a brother. And Paul will say the same thing in other letters as well, where he says, those who are bond masters, they must treat their servants, their slaves, with love, because they will have to give an account. And so this is Philemon 10 through 18. Paul says, I appeal to you for my child, and he's telling this to Philemon, my child Onesimus, whose father I became in my imprisonment. Formerly he was useless to me, but now he is indeed useful to you and to me. I am sending him back to you, sending my very heart. So you can see here, Onesimus, slave, right, is a co-worker of Paul, and you can see here um, that he has a deep relationship, whose father I became. Verse 12, I am sending him back to you, sending my very heart. I would have been glad to keep him with me in order that he might serve me on your behalf during my imprisonment for the gospel. But I preferred to do nothing without your consent, in order that your goodness might not be my compulsion, but of your own accord. For this perhaps is why he parted from you for a while, that you might have him back forever. No longer as a bondservant, this word doulos, slave, but more than as a slave, as a beloved brother, especially to me. But how much more do you both in the flesh, in the Lord? So if you consider me your partner, receive him as you would receive me. So there's clearly something that happened with Onesimus, whether he's a runaway slave, whatever. But he's been with Paul, and Paul wants to send him back, right? Because he thinks he would be useful. And you can see in verse 17, Paul says, receive him like you would receive me. So, kind of big picture, right? Paul encourages Philemon to treat his slave, his bondservant, Onesimus, not as a just casual slave, but you can see here in verse 16, as a beloved brother. And this is the power of the gospel, is that in Christ we are one, right? And Paul will say this especially in Galatians, right? There's no Jew, there's no Greek. We are all one in Christ, and we see that outlined here, the power of the gospel. And that brings us to the end then of Paul's letters. How glorious they are.